Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly edition of The Wrap. I'm Laura Leslie, WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief.
And I am Will Doran, WRAL State Government Reporter.
And it is inauguration time, except that got canceled because of the weather. We're recording this Friday afternoon and waiting for the snow to start coming down. And I'm sure there's a lot of disappointment in the Stein camp because there was a lot of plans for this.
Yeah, and of course, the irony that we haven't even had snow here in years here in Raleigh. And then, the day that he was going to have his big party, it snowed. And if that sounds familiar to people, it's because the exact same thing happened to Roy Cooper in early 2017 when he was going to have his inaugural party. Also got canceled due to a snowstorm.
Yeah, that was an ice storm, actually. I remember it well. So anyway, he did get sworn in, so we don't have to worry about that. And everybody else got sworn in already, too. So new news, this just breaking today, actually. We've been following for a long time the story of Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson's wife's business and dealings with the DHHS and some federal, I think it's USDA money, I believe. Yes. And so last we heard, they owed the states, they had to pay back, I think, $140,000 or so. And that money, of course, with the state has got to go back to the feds. So there's been a development there.
Yes, the State Department of Health and Human Services has lowered the amount of money that they owe. So, one of, I guess, the first actions from the new Stein administration is cutting the amount that this nonprofit is going to have to pay. And for people who haven't been following this group is called Balanced Nutrition. Yolanda Hill, who's Mark Robinson's wife, started about a decade ago, and it basically is kind of a middleman between the federal government and local daycares. It helps daycares get, like you said, federal money for meals, to feed the kids. And the state alleged that it was overbilling, submitting the same receipt multiple times to be reimbursed, submitting a receipt for X amount of money, but, saying that it was a different higher amount of money, submitting some expenses for, a daycare that appears to have never requested or received any of that funding. So, just kind of a series of financial errors or misdeeds on behalf of this nonprofit. And originally the state had said that it owed $132,000 and change. And just now that got knocked down to $101,000. So, we're still talking about, a six-figure
real money
figure, overpayment allegedly to this group that they're now going to need to repay by early February under the rules that the state has set up. They can still appeal. I have reached out to the lawyer for Ms. Hill and for Balanced Nutrition. He has not gotten back to me yet. But, this has been dragging on for, close to a year now. I mean, we were reporting on this back in, April of 2024, and here it is, January of 2025, and, could easily be, appealed and continue going on. So, we're going to keep tracking it, but certainly an interesting development there.
For sure. In the meantime, legislature got back into session this week with their ceremonial Wednesday swearing in. We heard from, of course, Senate Leader Phil Berger, and as expected, Destin Hall, a Republican from Caldwell County, became the new House Speaker. We saw that coming, right? In his acceptance speech, I should say, the new Speaker Hall, talked a little bit about his upbringing and about his priorities as he's coming into this office. He talked about education and the economy, but he also talked about Helene relief, and so did Berger. I mean, it was really pretty clear from the get-go that this is, we don't know yet how Berger and Hall are going to work together, right? It's going to be a different, a different dynamic, but we know at least that they're in agreement on that one.
Well, the legislature really ended 2024 on kind of a sour note with a lot of people in terms of Helene funding, including some Republican members, who voted against that bill that, was ostensibly a Helene bill, but really was about a whole lot of other things. And, they said that we're not doing enough. And so, they've tried to, make it clear in these speeches, starting this session, that Helene recovery is going to continue to be, a big priority of theirs. And I saw the House on Friday announced a new Helene-focused committee that's going to be led by a bunch of Western North Carolina Republicans, and then also John Bell, who's also going to be the new rules chair. So Representative Bell
he's been through his thing in Eastern North Carolina, right? Because they're looking back on the Rebuild NC, the NCORE stuff, and saying this cannot happen again.
Yeah. No, and he's really led a lot of the efforts to when Roy Cooper was the governor, to hold his people's feet to the fire on some of those problems with responses to Matthew and Florence. So he'll be primed from the get-go on that. And Josh Stein had his own executive order setting up his own Helene specific group within state government to kind of take this away from NCORE, which had been plagued by all those problems. And
it's Grow NC, I think, is the name of the program in the governor's office, and he poached the Wake County Commissioner's chair, Matt Calabria, to run that.
Yes.
And then there's also going to be a sort of a mirror effort inside the Department of Commerce, right?
Yes. This is obviously a multi-pronged effort. You've got the thing in Commerce. You also have an advisory committee that Josh Stein set up, and trying to kind of make an olive branch here with some of his early actions as governor. He made Senator Kevin Corbin, a Republican from out west, the co-chair of this advisory committee for Stein on Helene relief, saying looking at a Republican state lawmaker and saying, I want to hear from you. I want you to be kind of helping lead some of these efforts. Asheville Mayor Esther Mannheimer is the other co-chair of that, and she's obviously a Democrat, so have a bipartisan response there.
Yeah, and I think it is telling that the day after he was sworn in last week, the first thing he did was go up to Western North Carolina and announce a bunch of executive actions, some of which were meant to speed up getting people into trailers by saying, hey, we'll pay for the trailers and FEMA will reimburse us. Reimburse us, which is something the lawmakers had been, well, I don't know if they're going to reimburse us. And he said, yeah, they will. 100%. We have a guarantee, so we're going to go ahead and do that. I kind of asked Hall what he thinks about, this new recovery program. And, basically he just said, NCORE was such a mess. We are hopeful that this will be better, but we will be watching it very closely.
Yeah. Well, and part of the reason, too, just on Helene in general, that I think this is going to be such a priority and that they're talking about this so much is they're not necessarily going to have a supermajority going into this session. And Helene relief is definitely something with big bipartisan support. So that's something that can actually get done.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Depending on what else gets
details.
attached to it, right? Yeah.
In an ideal world, it's something that can actually get done. But, the last 2 years, Republicans have been able to pass pretty much whatever they want because they've had the supermajority. But when they didn't have the supermajority in the couple of years before that, Cooper's vetoes, all of them were able to be upheld. So it's going to be really interesting to watch to see if Republicans, especially on some hot button issues, are going to be able to swing over, one or two Democrats that might be needed on some key votes, or if we're going to see some big stalemates on some of the big, policy issues that come up.
All right, we're going to take a break here to pay some bills for a moment. Please hang with us, and we'll be right back after this. And we're back with this week's version of the wrap, I should say, chapter. Lots going on outside the legislature this week. And one thing that you've been following really closely are the twists and turns in the Supreme Court race.
Oh, my gosh.
It's just Byzantine. Every time I turn around is something else was filed by someone else in some other court with some other judge. And so break it down for us. Where are we?
It's the ping pong match of election litigation at this point. Jefferson Griffin appears to have lost the race for state Supreme Court to the Democratic incumbent Allison Riggs. She seems to have held on by about 700 votes out of 5 million, so tiny little sliver. But Griffin thinks that about 60,000 people should not have been allowed to vote at all and had their ballots counted and should now have their ballots thrown out. The State Board of Elections has rejected that, said, no, we're not doing that. So now he's taken it to court, and he filed it in state court. Then it got kicked up to the federal court. Then it got kicked back down to the state Supreme Court, who said, State Board of Elections, you can't certify Riggs as the winner. We have to let this play out. But now it got kicked back up to federal court. So I'm sitting here refreshing my phone, making sure nothing's been filed. But as of right now, the Federal Court of Appeals hasn't done anything yet. So we're still waiting on them to say basically whether they want to take this or if they're going to let the state Supreme Court take this and basically rule on its own membership.
Right. And the argument that the Democrats made in trying to get it into federal court was that it affected elections. and voters and, voting rights, and that this would violate voting rights, the Voting Rights Act, so therefore it's a federal issue. Republicans say, no, it's a state's issue. And the judge, the first federal judge, who was a Trump appointee, Myers, agreed with them, right, and sent it back to.
Well, and the other interesting thing here is the same legal theory that Griffin is using here was also the same legal theory that the state and national Republican parties had in a lawsuit that they filed during the 2024 elections, trying to block these people from voting ahead of time. And that same judge, Judge Myers, and also the Fourth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals shot that down, said, no, it's too late in the process. We can't stop these people from voting. And so they rejected those efforts. So, a big reason why the Democrats want this to be back in federal court is they're saying, okay, if it was too late before election day, it's absolutely too late after the election is over to change the rules and, for the government to essentially tell people that they can vote, but then to decide, oh, wait, no, we're going to change the rules. And since you didn't follow the rules that you didn't know you had to follow, we're going to throw out your ballot.
And there was one Republican judge on the state Supreme Court who basically agreed with that.
Yes.
There was Republican, I think it's Richard Dietz, is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. Richard Dietz dissented when the Supreme Court, like I mentioned earlier, ordered the State Board of Elections not to certify Riggs as the winner. He said that he actually did share some of the concerns that Griffin raised, but he said, look, it is too late. We can't come in and change the rules after the fact and do this. Too bad. We should address this for future elections, but for right now, if you tell people they can vote, you've got to let them vote. But that dissent did not sway any of his other Republican colleagues, and the vote was 4-2, not 7 voting because Riggs has recused herself.
Obviously, yeah.
So if this goes back to the state Supreme Court, it's going to be really interesting to see if Riggs is able to convince just one more Republican to side with her. Because, with a 4-2 vote, if she can peel off one of those Republicans, then it's a 3-3, it's a tie. They're not going to be able to do anything with a tie. And then so I would assume, I'm no lawyer here, and lawyers can argue for anything, but, typically when you have a tie, nothing can happen. So you would assume that she would be certified the victor as long as she can get, one more Republican on her side. So
big if.
But it might just be decided in federal court anyways, so we'll see what happens there.
In the meantime, we learned this week from State Treasurer Brad Briner, our new State Treasurer, that it looks like insurance costs are probably going to go up for the state health plan.
Yes.
And that is something that I know former State Treasurer Dale Folwell fought against for years. He said that, state employees don't make enough as it is. Let's try to keep, the cost of it down. And there was a good business reason for that because the cost kept going up and people kept getting out of the plan. The young people that make the plan solvent were getting insurance elsewhere.
Right.
Because it was too expensive. However, they are now facing a massive shortfall in their budget. I mean, they're in deficit as of next year. And so Briner said, we're just going to have to raise these rates. And so it was interesting, though. I think from what I read, he talked about he wanted to raise it sort of by what you make, which is unusual. Usually it's sort of a flat
Yeah,
increase.
I mean, this would be a huge change in how the state health plan operates. I mean, I think probably just about everyone listening to this, you just pay whatever your employer tells you health insurance costs.
Right.
But Briner said that he wants to start this new kind of means-tested system so that, state employees who make more money would pay more for the same coverage as someone who makes less money. So that would be really interesting, if he goes through with that. He said basically everyone would pay at least $20 a month more. Is kind of the number he's looking at. That's not set in stone yet, but that was what he threw out at this meeting this past week. Some people could end up paying a lot more than $20. I will say, if you've got one of the plans where you're, insuring children or a spouse, it can get really expensive. I mean, $500, $600, $700 a month, depending on the details. But if you're a state worker who's only insuring yourself, you might only be paying $25 a month for your health insurance, which is, as someone coming from the private sector, a steal.
Pretty good. So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely some room to work with there. But Briner, for the last couple of years, Falwell was really kind of hammering lawmakers for not doing enough to support the plan. And Briner didn't really disagree, but he just said it's kind of a moot point. They're not going to do it, so we're going to have to find another way to do it.
Right.
So
yeah.
I'm sure lawmakers were happy to hear that.
Right.
Right.
It was essentially, yes, they should be putting more money into this, but let's be realistic, they won't. So we need to just figure out a new way forward.
A little bit more news coming from the Council of State. We had AG Jeff Jackson filing his first higher profile lawsuit. This is actually sort of piggybacking on one that Stein filed against this real estate sort of, I don't even know what you would call it, clearinghouse, I guess, called Real Pages. So
it's like a software company that has an algorithm.
That would advise you how much you can get for your apartment. And so there's been a movement across the U.S. for different state AGs to sue this company because they say it's price fixing, essentially. And they blame it for the dramatic rises in rent that we've seen in some places where it's really difficult to otherwise account for that. So what Jackson did in his lawsuit is to name 5 or 6 really big landlord or property management companies that actually use Real Pages as part of that lawsuit. So it's an interesting move. Definitely gets more parties in the lawsuit. I'm not sure it's going to make it move any faster.
No, it'll probably slow it down. But I think what it could do is really add to the amount of money that North Carolina could eventually get. Most of these things typically get settled out of court anyways.
Right.
But if you look at the filing and what they're asking for if they do win, I mean, it's potentially billions of dollars just for North Carolina, let alone any of the other states who are involved in this lawsuit. So, the more companies that you add into a lawsuit like that, saying that, hey, do you want to be on the hook for hundreds of millions of dollars per state that you operate in? That tends to incentivize people to settle this a little more quickly. So we'll see how that goes.
And speaking of lawsuits, we want to mention, last but not least, you did a story earlier this week about Lisa Stone Barnes and her family farm. They're basically in receivership, I believe, because of default on a loan from a foreign company. Is that true?
Yes. They took out about $41 million in loans from this subsidiary of Rabobank, which is a Dutch bank that has some specialties in agriculture. The Dutch are great at growing flowers, so I guess they've become experts in agricultural financing, including for Barnes Family Farms, which is the largest producer of sweet potatoes in the world.
Wow, did not know.
Yes. North Carolina makes something like 2/3 of all of the sweet potatoes grown in the entire United States, and a whole lot of them come from Nash, Edgecombe, Wilson counties on about 20,000 acres that the Barneses farm out there. And so, you got 20,000 acres, you got to pay a lot of money to buy up that land, to buy tractors, to buy other equipment, to buy the seeds, and they just weren't able to pay. And this is, I don't think it's necessarily anything that, they personally did wrong. Maybe the bank will argue otherwise, but in general, I mean, we've seen, earlier this year, there was a huge drought here statewide in North Carolina that really hammered farmers. And then we had Hurricane Debbie, Hurricane Helene on top of that. It's just been a really rough year for all farmers. And it seems that they were just kind of a victim of some of those circumstances there.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think that is about all the time we have for this week. I do want to mention that On the Record this week on Saturday night will feature our new speaker, Destin Hall, and Representative Cynthia Ball speaking for the Democratic minority in the House. So if you are so inclined, you can catch it at 7 o'clock on Saturday night on WRAL, or, of course, you can find it online and watch it at any time. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next week here on The Wrap.